Are there any other votes? Announce the results.
Ayes 76, noes 35.
The bill is passed. Mr. Morelli.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to take up the next three bills off the debate list, if I may, beginning with calendar number 97 on page 8 by Mr. Weprin, followed by calendar 302 on page 17 by Mr. Dinowitz, and then in this grouping conclude with calendar number 612 on page 45 by Mr. Simbrowitz.
Clerk will read.
Assembly 2049A, Calendar 97, Mr. Weprin, an act to amend the executive law.
Read the last section.
This act shall take effect on the 60th day.
Clerk will record the vote. Are there any other votes? Announce the results.
Ayes 94, noes 4.
The bill is passed.
Assembly 7610E, Calendar 302, Mr. Dinowitz, an act to amend the general business law.
Read the last section.
This act shall take effect on the 90th day.
Clerk will record the vote. Are there any other votes? Announce the results.
Ayes 96, noes 3.
The bill is passed.
Assembly 9143A, Calendar 612. Mr. Simbrowitz, an act to amend the elder law.
Read the last section.
This act shall take effect immediately.
Clerk will record the vote. Are there any other votes? Announce the results.
Ayes 94, noes 2.
The bill is passed. Mr. Morelli.
Yes, sir. Thank you. If I could, the next two bills I'd like to take up are calendar number 660 on page 51 by Mr. Abadi, and then on page 26, calendar number 380, also by Mr. Abadi.
Clerk will read.
Assembly 5303, Calendar 660. Mr. Abadi, an act to amend the civil service law.
An explanation is requested. Mr. Abate.
Surely. This bill would authorize the Niagara Frontier Transportation Authority, the Rochester Genesee Regional Transportation Authority, the Capital District Transportation Authority, and the Central New York Transportation Authority to use compulsory arbitration, basically collective bargaining in their process.
Mr. Goodell.
Would the sponsor yield?
He certainly will. As soon
yes.
as we clear out that right by him, ladies and gentlemen, we're having a debate. Can you take that conversation? If you've got to talk, take it back. Proceed, Mr. Goodell.
Thank you, Mr. Abadi, for yielding. I appreciate your explanation that you said this would allow binding arbitration. Actually, it would.
It'd be binding. It shouldn't be allowed. Make it compulsory.
And how do these upstate transportation authorities feel about this? Have you heard from them?
I haven't heard from them, but if you notice the sponsor on this bill and the other bill, as the chair of government employees, they've sent some bills down to me outside of my region. By looking at the sponsor of the bills from upstate New York, I assume they've asked me to do it because the authorities and the employees there would want it.
Actually, we've received communications from all of them opposing it, but maybe that hasn't been forwarded yet. Can you explain the current process? If there's a dispute, an employee contract that's not resolved, am I correct? PERB is then involved?
Yeah, I mean, if it's not resolved, it can go on for a long time, and some of the arguments we've had. We've found it very successful over the years when people really get into a binding arbitration situation, that it does save a lot of aggravation, and it actually makes things more productive in the agency than the fighting back and forth. And we've had impasses, not only, I would say, with the Transportation Authority, we had some in the city of New York, but we've had it in our court systems and all, and we're trying our very best to work out, to keep the morale of the workers with the transit authorities going. Now, I'll be quite honest with you, I don't know that much about the upstate authorities, but on the word of I sponsored a senator, I've taken this bill on behalf of some of the employees there, and his knowledge of saying that they would want the bill.
Let me walk through what I understand to be the current process to make sure we're on the same wavelength. As I understand it, of course, if the parties reach agreement, that's the end of it.
Yep.
If they don't reach agreement, the first step is that PERB appoints a mediator to try to reach agreement. If that doesn't work, then PERB does a fact-finding board. If that doesn't work, then PERB makes a report to the governing body, correct?
Yeah, but there's nothing binding about any of those.
And then at the end of the day, it's the legislative body,
Not at the end of the day, at the end of the years.
whatever,
Okay.
I mean, at the end of that process,
Right.
the legislative body makes the final determination, subject, of course, to Triborough. And Triborough ensures that no benefit or salary can be reduced
Correct.
without consent. So what this bill does then, if I understand it correctly, is it takes the authority away from the governing board and gives it to a non-elected arbitrator who is not responsible for the budget, is not responsible for raising the fees to cover it, comes in and makes a recommendation, but is not selected to be a representative of part of the governing board, correct?
No, correct, but no different than we do in a number of other instances throughout the state of New York. There are different agencies that have it, and other agencies like these don't have it. And if we could have a uniform system, I think that would be much better. And we haven't seen any problems with where the compulsory arbitration is in there.
Well, actually, we have received a number of requests, haven't we not, from, for example, the Mayor's Association, as an example, asking us to amend the compulsory arbitration provisions because they did not adequately reflect the financial condition of the municipality.
If you would take into all the requests from some of the executives and the elected officials throughout the state, we would have no laws governing any of the procedures taking place between the municipality and the employee. You mentioned Triborough. There are a number of groups that are trying to do with the Triborough do away, and there are a number of bills in this House doing away with Triborough. One of the things you said that was good to protect the workers, there are people trying to take that away at the same time.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your comments on the bill.
On the bill, Mr. Goodell.
In New York, of course, we look to governing bodies to make decisions. And the governing bodies are responsible for balancing all the competing interests that we have. And so the governing body on the upstate transportation boards have to balance the cost of providing the service with the fees that they charge the people who use the system. And they're very sensitive about those fees because they don't want them too high, or people who are struggling to meet ends meet will have trouble accessing mass transit. And right now, that's their responsibility, and those boards are appointed by different people to represent those conflicting issues. At the end of the day, under the current process, PERB is involved throughout with mediation and fact-finding, and they give a recommendation. But at the end of the contract process, under the current law, it's those transportation boards that are trying to keep the rates as low as possible and still be fair and equitable to the employees. And even there, they can't reduce any benefits or wages because all that's protected under the Triborough. What this bill does is requires that if the authority that has to balance those issues can't reach agreement, that we bring in an outside arbitrator that was not selected to run the company, the transportation authorities, an arbitrator who might not even be a resident of that community, might not be a customer, doesn't have to answer to any of the costs that are imposed, comes in, makes a decision, leaves. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the way the system works, typically those arbitrators are agreed to by both the union and management. And so what happens is if an arbitrator rules completely against the union, he never has another arbitrator's job again, and he looks for a new occupation. And likewise, if he rules against management completely, he's out of a job and is looking for a new occupation. That's just the facts of life, guys. That's the way the system works. And so what happens? Doesn't matter who's right or who's wrong, the arbitrators always try to split the difference. And so if you're a negotiator, it's great. You start out in a completely unreasonable and untenable position. You drag the process out interminably because you know at the end you're going to split the difference, and you hope that the result that comes out is somewhere close to being reasonable. As a matter of public policy, we should, as a legislature, respect and honor the responsibility and authority of those who are charged with running these systems. And we should let them make the decision. Allowing them to have the authority to run their own operations, to keep rates as reasonable as possible while ensuring that they have a highly qualified and well-paid workforce, that's their responsibility. And that's why every one of these transportation authorities has written to us opposing this bill. Let's not take away authority from those who are given the responsibility to run the program and give it to someone who's not elected, not responsive to any elected officials, and doesn't have to face the consequences of their decision. For those reasons, I recommend against this bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Goodell. Mr. Morelli.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If I could ask members of the Ways and Means Committee to move to the Speaker's Conference Room. Members of Ways and Means in the Speaker's Conference Room.
Members of the Ways and Means Speakers Conference Room, Mr. Farrell is waiting for you there. Read the last section.
This act shall take effect immediately.
The clerk will record the vote. Are there any other votes? Announce the results.
Ayes 85, noes 28.
The bill is passed.
Assembly 6175, Calendar 380. Mr. Abadi, an act to amend the civil service law.
An explanation has been requested.
Sure. This bill is very similar to the previous bill. This bill would include the New York Power Authority as one of those entities to be included in the collective bargaining negotiations. Very similar, almost identical, different agencies.
On the bill, Mr. Goodell.
As the sponsor notes, this bill is essentially the same as the previous bill, only a different public entity. And the concerns that I expressed before are the same. Namely, we currently have a process in which PERB is involved in helping anyone who has a contract problem. They help with mediation. They help with fact-finding. At the end of the day, PERB makes a recommendation to the governing body, and the governing body has the opportunity to accept that or modify it or whatever. All the employees are protected by Triborough, which means that none of their benefits can go down without their consent. The current process works reasonably well and should remain in place. And for those reasons, I recommend that we do not extend binding arbitration to another public entity. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Goodell. Read the last section.
This act shall take effect immediately.
The clerk will record the vote.